According to. All right, so we're going to be looking at a PowerPoint on the authorship of John to begin with. I'll just bring it up on the big screen there. Again, let me know if you notice any problems with the PowerPoint or anything like that. So we'll be looking at the Johannine authorship. It's regarding the Johannine epistles. But before we look at that, we have some things to note first, just on how we do this. So because the Gospel of John doesn't include, like, hi, I'm John, the apostle, son of Zebedee, and I wrote this book, and the Johannine letters don't have that either. We do have these names, but some people believe that they were attached later. So we have to figure out who wrote these books, and there are also liberal scholars who deny the authorship of John in the Gospel of John and the Johannine epistles. Revelation is a different story, and we're not there. It's already got a lot to look at.
Do they?
Yeah, go ahead.
They give an alternate author?
Yeah, some people believe that perhaps Lazarus wrote the Gospel of John, and for the epistles of John, they don't really know at all. So they have some suggestions, but really no one that they offer for the epistles of John. All right, so we're looking at first, second, and third John here, and the first thing people look at is the external evidence. Let me just move my microphone a bit because it's blocking everything. So we look at the external evidence first, and this includes mostly just church father attestation in support of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So external evidence, what do the church fathers say about this and other 1st, 2nd century sources? So then we look at internal evidence, which is actually a bit more important than external evidence. Yeah, I just heard something. Could you repeat that?
Oh, sorry, I thought it was muted.
Okay, that's fine. No worries. So we look at internal evidence next, which is a little more important than external. So to get to the internal evidence of the Johannine epistles, which is 1, 2, and 3 John, we first have to look at the 4th Gospel's authorship. So once we establish the 4th Gospel's authorship, we can then make connections here with things like grammar, things like vocabulary and style, and all sorts of things to say that the Johannine epistles were written by the same author as the 4th Gospel. So first, this is the first part of the PowerPoint. I realize that things were getting really long, so we have to split this up into 2 weeks. Next week we'll look at the Johannine epistles. This week we're just looking at the 4th Gospel's authorship. So to get to the 4th Gospel, which is the Gospel of John, we have to go through the same steps pretty much. First we look at the external evidence, church father attestation. Then we'll look at the internal evidence for the Gospel of John. And the way we do that in the Gospel of John is we look at who the beloved disciple is. If we say that the beloved disciple is John, then we can make this connection here and say that the evangelist is the beloved disciple. And the evangelist is just a fancy term in gospel studies for the author of a gospel. So first evangelist, I'm just writing in the top right here. So the first evangelist wrote the first gospel, and the second evangelist wrote the second gospel, and we're looking at the 4th evangelist here writing the 4th gospel. And this is just a fancy gospel studies term that people use so that they don't assume the authorship of a book. Just because it's disputed, they won't say John's gospel, they'll just say the 4th gospel. And they'll just say the 4th evangelist instead of assuming their conclusion and giving authorship to whoever. And just so that things are a little easier, just because it's a disputed term. So alright, we're going to be looking at first the external evidence of church father attestation in the 4th Gospel. What do the church fathers say about who wrote the 4th Gospel? So first of all, some other external evidence. Martin Hengel plausibly argues, and this is D.A. Carson, so that's his word, plausibly. He argues that the title Gospel according to John was attached at the beginning. So according to John, that was attached at the beginning when it was starting to circulate, very, very early, pretty much immediately when it was starting to circulate. So that's some external evidence there. And, Okay, PowerPoint done, everybody. But we have to look at some other stuff as well. This is only plausible. So Theophilus of Antioch, a church father, is the first to unambiguously quote and ascribe authorship to John's gospel. So he ascribes John as the author of the fourth gospel. This was around 181 AD there. So 2nd century, pretty good, pretty early. And this is unambiguous. So we have other people coming before him, such as Tatian, Claudius Apollinaris, Athenagoras, and many more. They quote John and label him as an authoritative source. So other things, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian provide firm 2nd century evidence for the Apostle John as well. Irenaeus is probably one of the most notable on here because he knew Polycarp. So Polycarp was a martyr, just another church father. And Polycarp actually knew John, the Apostle John. So if Irenaeus is saying that John is the author of the Gospel of John, this is pretty good evidence that John was in fact the author of the Gospel of John because he had this connection down through the line here. So next, finally, we're just going to go through this real quickly, but even Dodd, C.H. Dodd, scholar, who discounts the view that the Apostle John wrote the Gospel, so he disagrees with John's authorship here, considers the external evidence formidable, adding of any external evidence to the contrary that could be called cogent, I am not aware. So he's not even aware of any external evidence that contradicts John's authorship here. So this is a very powerful case, and there's so much more that could be said here, but it's not contested at all that the external evidence is unanimous in pro John here. So it's not even contested, so we won't look at that much more. So let's look at the internal evidence now. So that's the external evidence, unanimous, even though people, liberal scholars, will pretty much ignore the external evidence. You can't just ignore it though. But we'll look at the internal evidence now. We have 5 points to get to the fourth evangelist. Number one, who was, well, that's not number one, but who was the fourth evangelist? Number one, we show that he's Jewish. Number two, from Palestine. Number three, an eyewitness of Christ. So you can see that we're starting out kind of big here, and then we start narrowing down our scope. Eyewitness of Christ, number three. Number four, an apostle of Christ, so one of the 12. Number five, the apostle John. So we just narrow the scope down. So there's so much to be said here, but I'll just go through number 1 and 2, and then I'll kind of touch on 3 to 5 all at the same time, just for time's sake. So number 1, that the author was Jewish. And I think this is really interesting so that you can see how scholars kind of look at these things, because again, there's nowhere in the gospel that John says explicitly that he is the author. So you have to kind of look at this in an interesting way and kind of examine it and analyze everything. So he was familiar with Jewish customs, and this is from Leon Morris's Studies in the Fourth Gospel, which is pretty much, honestly, one of the best, if not the best, books on the subject of the authorship of John and everything about the fourth gospel. So he's familiar with Jewish customs, and I list a couple of references here. Morris goes through a lot more and explanations as well, but this is pretty much all we need to know for now. He's well versed in obscure Jewish observances, so there's some verses there that the average person, especially a Gentile, would not be aware of. His vocabulary and structure is consistent with Jewish background, and he has some Aramaisms. And an Aramaism is something that calls back to the language of Aramaic, which was what the first century Jews spoke, pretty much all of them. That was their common language. So we have parataxis, a syndeton, and these are just really fancy grammatical structures. You don't need to know what those are. They're just fancy grammar that calls back to the Aramaic language. So he has also other Aramaic links, poetic structure, and Aramaic transliterations. And these ones you can actually look at, other than the weird grammar stuff that you have to be a scholar to know. But you can look at the Aramaic transliterations And those are all the verses for that, and there's also many more. So he's Jewish. This is pretty much not contested at all, so we don't need to go through much in detail there. Rarely contested, even among liberal scholars. So let's move on then to the second point, that he is a Jew from Palestine. So Westcott says, it is inconceivable that a Gentile living at a distance from the scene of religious and political controversy could have realized with vivid and unerring accuracy the relations of parties and interests which ceased to exist after the fall of Jerusalem. So this kind of depends on where you date the book. But after the fall of Jerusalem, things were destroyed, temple was demolished, landmarks were taken down, and all of that. So if you have knowledge of that time period after everything was destroyed, that is immense evidence for someone who grew up or who is very familiar with the area of Palestine here. So other topographical knowledge, we have those verses right there, which note that his topographical, geographical knowledge was real good of places and things. I'm going to quickly close my door. You can start looking at those verses if you want. It's just really interesting stuff. All right, coming back. So maybe you looked at all of those verses so far. No, there's a reason why we're not going through and quoting each of the verses here, because there's just so much evidence. So he's got good topographical knowledge, and he also has good knowledge of Jerusalem as well, and those are the relevant verses for that. So now we touched on the first 2 points. We're going to look at the beloved disciple, and this is a very important term here. I can't draw a straight line. I won't even try. So we're going to look at the beloved disciple here. And who is the beloved disciple? So this guy running around in the Gospel of John, and if you're not familiar with the Gospel of John, don't worry, I have some things here. So the beloved disciple reclined next to Jesus at the Last Supper. That's in 13:23 of John's Gospel. He was found at the cross and given a special commission, 19:26 to 27. This is really interesting. So I actually want to go through this real quick. So John 19:26, I'll just read it. So Jesus, seeing his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing there, so the disciple whom he loved, this is what we call the beloved disciple, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. So Jesus is about to die on the cross here, and he doesn't want to leave his mother all alone there, so he puts her in the charge of this beloved disciple, whoever this person is. So then there's other places where we see him at. He's seen at the empty tomb, and it's noted that he got there faster than Peter. So they're both running pretty much side by side, it sounds like, to the tomb, and John says that he got there first. And finally, at the end of John, this is the disciple who is testifying about these things and who has written down these things. And if you look at verses 20 to 23, you'll see that we're talking about the beloved disciple here. And so when John says, or when the fourth gospel says, this is the disciple, he's talking about the beloved disciple that he was talking about in 20 to 23. So this is the beloved disciple. And on that note about getting there faster than Peter to the empty tomb, this is just pretty interesting stuff. So I'll read the verse here. Running together, and the other disciple ran ahead faster than Peter and came to the tomb first. So we know that other disciple is the beloved disciple if we read the previous context. But he got there first. And this brings up an interesting point. It's actually, well, for conservative Christians, it's just funny to say that John, writing this gospel, he got there faster than Peter. Like a little kind of a petty challenge or whatever here. But this is also actually used as an objection to John's authorship in the gospel. Otherwise, it would look like this, just to put it in the illustration of the language that the youngsters use these days. So this is a meme, and if John is saying that he got there faster than Peter, John is pretty much giving himself a medal here. He's patting himself on the back. Oh yeah, I beat Peter, racing him. So just Really funny point, but it's also used as an objection to John's authorship. And we'll actually look at this in more detail at the end. So let's kind of move on then. Number 3 and 4, let me just check the chat real quick. Okay, no one said anything in the chat, so hopefully everything's working here. So points 3 and 4, the beloved disciple continue. And we're also specifically going to look at the eyewitness and apostle part, which is points 3 and 4 on our list of internal evidence. So number 1, the beloved disciple was at the Last Supper. So already this immediately points him to one of the 12, most likely. Only the apostles joined Jesus, and we look at the synoptics, Mark 14:17, and the parallels there. That's what PAR stands for, parallels of that. So we see parallels in Matthew and Luke for that same event. So only the apostles joined Jesus, and some people contest this. They say, well, maybe other apostles joined them, other disciples, some random people perhaps. But really we don't see any evidence of that at all. All we see are the 12 here and Jesus. And we also see the owner of the upper room, sort of. We don't really see him in the action or anything like that. So the beloved disciple was at the Last Supper. He reclined with him. So this points him as an apostle and an eyewitness to the events already. And 5a, the beloved disciple. Who is this beloved disciple? Is this John? And if the beloved disciple is John, who wrote the 4th gospel? So anyway, the person who wrote the 4th gospel lived long enough that a rumor arose that he would not die. Neither John nor James, his brother, son of Zebedee, these two are the sons of thunder, neither of them is mentioned by name in the gospel. And we even see the obscure disciples, the obscure of the 12 mentioned as well. So this is pretty significant. These two are not mentioned by name in the gospel. But James is martyred early. And we learned that from Acts 12, 1-2. So if James is martyred early, then he couldn't have written this book, and there was no rumor that could have arose from him that he would not die. So this pretty much excludes James, points to John here, that he's not mentioned by name in the gospel at all. And John is also constantly in the company of Peter as the beloved disciple is. So we learned that John and Peter are pretty close. They're pretty close. They're buddies, and they do all sorts of things together. And we learned that from the Synoptic Gospels, as well as from Acts, some verses there, as well as Galatians as well, where it lists Peter and John together. So finally, we see that John the Baptist is simply called John. And in the Synoptics, John the Baptist is given an introduction as if to distinguish him from the other John, the Apostle John. So only John the Apostle would feel no need to distinguish himself from another John. That's pretty much what I'm going with there. That just makes sense. So it is most likely John is the beloved disciple. Let me just write that down. And this is just most likely. It's not 100%, but it just doesn't make any sense either way. And we have all of these indicators of John being the beloved disciple. So let's move on then to the final point for the internal evidence that the evangelist is the beloved disciple. So we learned before that an evangelist in gospel studies means an author of a gospel. And they just do this so that they don't assume their conclusion. So the 4th evangelist wrote the 4th gospel. So if we can show that the beloved disciple is John, and that we can show that the beloved disciple is the evangelist, then we can show that John is the evangelist and that John wrote the 4th gospel. So we start with this verse here. It's super important. This is the disciple who is testifying about these things and who has written down these things. This happens at the end of the Gospel of John, kind of a conclusion, pretty much. So verse 24 is best seen as an answer to verse 20-21. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. I think this should be and there. I think I made a typo. But Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. Whom Jesus loved, that's the beloved disciple. So when he saw this one, Peter said to Jesus, Lord, what about this one? And, well, we see this one, this is the disciple who is testifying about these things and who has written down these things. So that connection there of authorship. As the same beloved disciple throughout the fourth gospel, verse 24 must refer to the entire gospel and not merely chapter 21. So because the beloved disciple, and we looked at verses there before, how he reclined at the Last Supper with Jesus and how he ran to the tomb, we see this phrase before, so most likely the same beloved disciple who wrote chapter 21 and the passages there also wrote the entire Gospel of John, because we see that same phrase that he uses of himself. So finally, if the beloved disciple is John, if the beloved disciple is the evangelist, then John is the evangelist. He is the author of the Gospel of John. I'm just going to check the chat real quick. I don't have a second screen. So no one said anything in the chat. That's fine. Hopefully you're all following along and understanding what's going on here. So let's look at some objections now. There are people who object to this. Number one, no Christian would call himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. And this is, it's probably the most popular objection to John's authorship. They say, oh, John wouldn't be that petty, or oh, John wouldn't call himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. That would be so prideful and everything like that. But let's look at this term. So number one, my contention is that this is not a prideful statement, but a personal statement. So he's just saying this about himself. He's not putting anyone else down. He's just saying that I am a disciple who Jesus loved. So Paul actually uses personal terms of this kind of endearment as well. And I no longer live, but Christ lives in me, and that life I now live in the flesh. I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Galatians 2:20. So Paul uses these personal pronouns of himself. He's not putting anyone else down. He's not putting the other apostles down here because he's not using we. He's not putting down other Christians. This is just a personal term that he uses of himself. And it's also, you can see some things in Ephesians 3:14-21 if you want to look at that. So D.A. Carson says it's not the mark of arrogance, it is rather the mark of brokenness, using these personal terms. And even today, Christians sing in the first person singular, I am his and he is mine, or Christ died for me. Does that mean that Christ didn't die for anyone else? Does that mean that John is saying that, well, Jesus didn't love the other apostles, or Jesus loved me more? No, none of that's going on. It's just a personal term of endearment and a mark of brokenness as well. And looking at other hypotheses that the Gospel of John was not written by John, other people, whoever wrote the Gospel of John sounds like a fanboy. I don't even know the term for that. But if you are someone else other than John and you're singling out one apostle, not even Peter, you're singling out John, it sounds like you're some sort of fanboy, part of the John fan club. Yeah, Jesus loved the disciple John more than he loved anyone else. So it's just doesn't make any sense. The best case is that John wrote it. Second objection that we'll look at, why doesn't the author mention his name? And this can be an objection or just an interesting question to look at. Why not? So here's some reasons for that. Number one, to focus the testimony on God. Right? This is super important. Everything pointing to God, everything pointing to Jesus, not me. Number two, it was also dangerous to advertise yourself as a Christian leader in this time, especially around the area of Palestine, where you got the Jews running around you trying to kill you, and you got the Romans who didn't like you either and wanting to make the Jews happy and things like that. So it was just dangerous. Next, John is already well known by his audience. So 24 to 25, it just says I. And we already read these verses. It was about, this is the disciple writing down these things, I am testifying, and so on and so forth. So he assumes pretty much that he's well known by his audience already. He doesn't need to introduce himself here. There's also common practice among circular letters to not include the sender's name. And we see that in 1 John as well. We kind of looked at this was a circular letter. 1 John, it was meant to be circulated around to people. So it doesn't include the sender's name or the recipient's name or any terms of address like that, just so that it would have a wider audience. And this is also the same with the other Gospels. So F.F. Bruce notes, it is noteworthy that while the 4 canonical Gospels could afford to be published anonymously, the apocryphal Gospels, which began to appear from the mid-2nd century onwards, claimed falsely to be written by the apostles or other persons associated with the Lord. So like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter, these false Gospels running around, they try to attribute authorship to an apostle. But we see that these 4 canonical Gospels, most likely because they were so well known and so well respected, with the authors still alive to back them up and the disciples running around at that time, they could afford to be published anonymously. They don't need to brag about authorship or try to ascribe false authorship or anything like that, because they were already just so well known at the time. So the final objection we'll look at is John wouldn't be prideful or petty and say things like how he beat Peter to the tomb. So this is an interesting one here. So first, my contention is that this is not about superiority or pride, though. It's about various gifts and strengths and weaknesses. Here's just a really good quote from C.K. Barrett, with Carson paraphrasing him. So 21 to 24, this was the authorship verse, must be read with the verses that precede it. It is given to Peter to feed the flock of God and to glorify God by his death, while it is given to the beloved disciple to live a long time and to serve as the one who writes this book, serving as a witness to the truth. If the beloved disciple arrives at the tomb first, Peter enters first, and John actually records this. Peter enters first. If the beloved disciple is said to believe, it is not said that Peter fails to believe. The statement is part of the description that is moving towards his authentication as the author of this book. So, first of all, that's a really good quote for this objection, but I just want to note that C.K. Barrett doesn't believe that the beloved disciple is John, but I believe there's strong evidence against that. But we're just using him here for a good quote against this particular objection there. And that is pretty much the 4th Gospel. So we've covered the authorship of the 4th Gospel. We're going to look at 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John next week. But here we see, again, we looked at Church Father attestation. It's absolutely unanimous in favor of John being the author of the 4th Gospel. We looked at internal evidence. We showed that the beloved disciple is John. We then showed that the evangelist, the author of the Gospel, is the beloved disciple. And so John, the apostle, son of Zebedee, is the author of the 4th Gospel. So some other objections real quick. Some people think that Lazarus wrote it because he was loved by Christ, but lots of people were loved by Christ, and Lazarus was not at the Last Supper as the beloved disciple was, and there's so many problems here. So honestly, this being at the Last Supper pretty much excludes so many different theories that people have right off the bat. Excludes all of them, and it is most likely that John is the author there. So that concludes our first part of the PowerPoint. Next week we'll go through the second half, which will be moving from 4th Gospel authorship, 4th Gospel authorship, all the way to Johannine epistles written by the same author. So that's for next week. Do we have any questions on everything that we just looked at? We do have a question. So Sound asks, so John experienced Jesus' love, and because he writes the gospel, he's talking about his experience, not to put himself over others. And yes, I believe that is exactly the case there. He's just saying, using it in personal terms, I'm the disciple whom Jesus loved, not that other people weren't loved, or that I was loved more, but just a personal term of endearment. Just like how we say, Christ died for me. Christ died on the cross for me, for my sins, and we say that today as well. Any other questions on anything that we just covered? All right, I mean, we covered a lot of ground there. And now we're going to look at, let me just keep these annotations. Do we have a volunteer? Kind of shift gears really hard here. I'll turn off the video there. So we're going to shift gears really hard here and look at 2 John, which is our Bible study for today. So this is pretty much unrelated other than who authored 2 John. So any volunteers to read the entirety of 2 John?
Can give it a shot.
Yeah, that would be great.
The elder, to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all those who have known the truth, because of the truth which abides in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with you from God the Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father, in truth and love. I rejoice greatly, and I have found some of your children walking in truth, as we received commandment from the Father. And now I plead with you, lady, not as though I wrote a new commandment to you, but that which we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. This is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, that as you have heard from the beginning, you should walk in it. For many deceivers have gone out into the world who do not confess Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. Look to yourselves that we do not lose those things that we worked for, but that we may receive a full reward. Whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house, nor greet him, for he who greets him shares in his evil deeds. Having many things to write to you, I did not wish to do so with paper and ink, but I hope to come to you and speak face to face, that our joy may be full. The children of your elect sister greet you. Amen.
Perfect. All right, we just finished an entire book of the Bible. Congratulations, everybody. Just an entire book of the Bible there. So that was 2 John. And just to kind of tie it into 1 John, because they're very much related, I'll just note the similarities here. So he starts out with a greeting, and this is actually a dissimilarity first, but in 1 John, he doesn't say to such and such or to this other person, and he doesn't call himself anything either. But in 2 John, he calls himself the elder, and it's directed to the elect lady and her children, which we'll look at a little later, but I just want to note the other similarities. So some other similarities that we can look at is verse 5 there. Not as if I were writing a new commandment to you, but one that we have from the beginning, that we should love one another. So we see this commandment from the beginning all the way in 1 John. We see that mentioned a number of times, and we see the theme of love in 1 John as well. So after that, verse 7, for many deceivers have gone out into the world. This is talking about the secessionists that we looked at in 1 John. So 1 John chapter 2, there were these people who left John's church, or the Johannine circle of churches, and they're running around spreading false gospel. That's what's talking about in verse 7 there. And they do not confess that Jesus Christ came in the flesh. So this goes back to 1 John 4:2, where we see that people have to confess that Jesus Christ was actually incarnate in the flesh. And verse 7 of 2 John says that this person is the deceiver and the antichrist. Again, calling back to chapter 4 of 1 John. So watch yourselves. All these different warnings as well. And if you don't remain in God or abide in the teachings of Christ, verse 9, you don't have God. This goes back to 1 John as well. Otherwise, if you do, this person has both the Father and the Son. So this kind of back and forth, and being in the Father, having the Father and the Son. So very similar to 1 John there. And it's easy to note the similarities because it's just 13 verses here. But this is one of the things that we'll look at next week in showing that 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were all written by the same author, and that they were written by the same author as the person who wrote the Gospel of John. So just really interesting stuff. All right, bring it back to you guys. Do we have any questions or anything that you want to bring up that you thought was interesting here in 2 John?
What's a liberal theology?
Oh, liberal authorship or liberal scholarship. Yeah, I would say liberal scholarship. So liberal scholarship is, well, it depends on who you are, but they essentially go against the traditional teachings that we've had for a long time now. So, for example, with the authorship of the Gospel of John that we looked at, conservative scholarship, traditional scholarship, would say that John is the author of the Gospel of John, and the church father. It all starts with the church fathers in this case, so that is a millennia-long tradition there. But liberal scholars will kind of go against the mold there and say that someone other than John wrote the Gospel of John. That's just what I mean when I say liberal scholarship. I didn't quite catch that when you unmuted your microphone, but unless you say something else, I'll assume that you got that. So any other questions? Okay, gotcha, Dogman. So yeah, okay. So Haley has a question there. Who is the elect lady? And this is a really interesting question. Some people think that the word elect is actually part of her name, or that lady is part of her name as well. So it might be the Lady Eclecta, or the lady, or the elected curia, or someone like that. But actually, I believe that the evidence for this strongly points to this actually being a way to say church. So addressed to the church and children of the church there. So some reasons for this, and Colin Cruz, our scholar for the letters of John, he says that the singular children, your singular children, walking in the truth in verse 4, but in the rest of the letter, he addresses all his readers in the second person plural you, suggesting that the chosen lady and her children is another way of addressing all members of the local church. So that's just a grammatical reason for it. Second reason, in the Old Testament and the Apocrypha, Israel is referred to as a wife, a bride, mother, and daughter with these feminine terms. So there's some precedent for a Christian community to be addressed in similar terms. It's a possibility. And in 1 Peter 5:13, the church in Rome is described as she who is in Babylon, indicating that New Testament Christians could speak of a Christian community as a woman. And number 4, another reason is that it appears to be conveying the greetings of the elders' Christian community to his reader at the end. So we'll look at verse 13 there. The children of your elect sister greet you. So this would be really weird, saying, okay, hello, woman, you're elect, and your elect sister person, that person's children, they're greeting you. So that would be just kind of weird. So there's pretty good evidence, I think, to say that the elect lady and her children is just talking about the local church. Any other questions? Okay, Draco has a question there. Mainly the message of love. I find that message to be throughout the gospel. I really find it interesting as a writer to find such a solid theme and message throughout the New Testament. Yeah, definitely. I think that's super interesting as well. There's just so much about love, especially in 1 John. I mean, pretty much everything calls back to love, and you have to love your brother if you are a Christian, and he contrasts that love with hatred for the brother. And that's in 1 John. So if you hate your brother, then it doesn't seem like you're a Christian at all. So again, banking on that theme of love. And just like you mentioned, it's really throughout the New Testament. It's just such an amazing theme. Any other things that you guys want to note? But yeah, just to bank off of what Draco said there again, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. This is really the commandment that John is calling back to, at least one of them. So verse 6 there, and this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. And this is the commandment, singular, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. From 1 John, we see that this is a commandment to love. And from John's Gospel, written probably by the same author, we see that's most likely what he's referring to here as well. So real interesting though, in verse 6, you don't really need to know this. This is just interesting. He starts plural commandments, then he goes to singular commandment. And let me just pull this up here from John. So John 15:10, where Jesus is speaking, "If you keep my commandments," plural, "you will remain in love just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love." And then in verse 14, "You are my friends if you do what I command you." Kind of singular there. As well as singular in verse 12 of chapter 15, "This is my commandment," singular, "that you love one another just as I have loved you." So I believe that in 2 John here, he's talking about Jesus' commandments first, then his singular commandment next. And it's interesting, but Jesus' singular commandment is just that they follow his plural commandments that he talked about earlier, especially about loving one another, things like that. So just, I know it's kind of confusing, but it's interesting. Follow the commandment of the command that I gave you to follow the other commandments. Anyway, one thing that I want to note real quick, just a question for all of you to answer. Verses 10 to 11 of 2 John. "If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house and do not speak a greeting to him, because the one who speaks a greeting to him shares in his evil deeds." What does this mean? What does this mean for hospitality and things like that? And we'll answer your question later, Bogani, after this one, verses 10 to 11. What do you guys think about that?
Does not bring him into his house mean don't bring him into your heart? Like, don't bring his ideas or teachings into your heart, because it's possible that could lead you astray. Like, it isn't a literal thing of don't actually give him, maybe not like, don't actually give him like help or need if he needs it, but don't bring his like deeds into your heart.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to take it. I think that's definitely a possibility, because when you talk about ancient, especially in this area, ancient hospitality in the Mediterranean area, you're really talking about welcoming someone into your home, providing for them, caring for them, and being their link to the rest of the community. So pretty much if you affirm someone into your household and affirm them as a good guest, and that person goes around saying, "Oh yeah, this Jimmy person welcomed me into their home, he was a great person, and now I'm going to be spreading false gospel to you." And it would seem like you're affirming that, which is what I think verse 11 is about there, because the one who speaks a greeting to him shares in his evil deeds. So we could take it, as you noted, maybe not specifically about home exactly, but the idea behind all of this with the hospitality rules and everything like that. And just to add to that, back in this time, there were no really established formal churches. So they had house churches. So it could also be that if you were welcoming them into your house church, and we see that this is to a church, in verse 1 to the elect lady, to probably the church, and verse 13 there again to the church. So this could be about welcoming someone into your house church and allowing them to kind of preach, and they would be preaching false gospel and things like that. The other thing to note is that in Christian greetings, they were generally affirming that the other person is a Christian. Whoever you're greeting, if you give them a Christian greeting, you're affirming that they are a Christian and you're blessing them and affirming what they do. But John says, don't speak a greeting to them. And I think he means that kind of particular Christian greeting, because if you do speak a greeting to them, you share in their evil deeds because you're affirming what they're doing and thinking and saying that they are a Christian when in fact they're actually not. They're an antichrist. So all right, Draco says they no longer seem to be your neighbor, linking back to the Good Samaritan. And yeah, that's a really good point there. If they're spreading false gospel, don't sound like a good person to be around. But that's not excluding that you should be caring for every person in general and being there for them and talking with them and communicating with them. It's just letting them have some sort of authority or affirming their false witness, things like that. So finally, we'll close. Last question, because we're running out of time here. Bogani says, what are some ways to improve the way we love our neighbors? How can we love like God? What do you guys think? Give us some practical examples that we can use.
I guess the first example would be witnessing to them about the gospel in an uncompromised manner.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So, witnessing to people, if you have knowledge that could, well, if you have knowledge of someone and a relationship that could save someone from the fiery torment of hell, then I think it would be pretty important to share that with them. And I like Haley's comment as well. I don't think we could ever love like God. And I think that's super important as well, especially in 1 John, where John says that God loved us first and gave his only son. We didn't love him first. God loved us first. And yeah, I think that's important to always remember there. Any other ideas? How to love one another?
Always try and put yourself on a level playing field with everyone. So don't ever feel like just because you know Christ and they don't, that instantly makes you better than them. Like it's that idea that a lot of like I grew up in a very like atheist humanist environment, and you get this idea that some Christians feel like they have a sense of superiority, exactly like how it was described there when it's like, oh, that can't be written by John because John called himself the disciple Jesus loved and stuff like that. Sometimes it does just, take to really love your neighbor is to get on their level and just kind of show them, even though I know the truth, it doesn't make me better or worse than you. In fact, I now know my sins, which makes me feel worse than you, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's really important as well. It's definitely a stumbling block for many people, thinking that Christians are prideful and things like that. So, all right, other people had some good comments too, but we're going to have to close this out now. And does anyone want to close this out with a word of prayer? Any volunteers? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Heavenly Father, today we thank you for allowing us to gather together as a group of believers to speak about your word, the most important thing that we can do to feed ourselves with the bread of life, to have knowledge from you that we could not have on our own. For Jesus said that without me you can do nothing. I pray for those who have unspoken prayer requests or for those who are in need right now, for there are many and there will always be many in this world that is ruled by the prince of this world. So I pray that we all can, that believers in Christ can see that we are on common ground and that we spread the gospel to all nations, for there are believers of Christ in all nations. Lord, I thank you for the for this Bible study, and I thank you for allowing us to just have another breath on this planet, and hopefully we can use those breaths that we have to show people who Jesus Christ was and what he did for them, for he was sent by the love of God and is the Messiah, the Son of God. Thank you, Lord, and in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.